Hey guys, welcome to another Pokemon Talk with CALLOUS. This is going to be a hot topic. This is, I think, potentially going to be one of the best talks that we've had because this affects a very large portion of the Pokemon population. We're talking about bans and specifically how Smogon approaches banning or unbanning things, specifically in old gens. And since we all play on the simulator that plays by Smogon's rules, pretty much anybody who plays Pokemon remotely competitively, this is relevant to them. And I think I have assembled a perfect team to talk about this. No disrespect to my past guests, Cowboy Dan, Disno, Marco P, but these two guys have both been around for a very long time. They both played competitively longer than I have, and they have both been in positions of power on Smogon. We've got JabbaTheGriffin, who was a Smogon staff member at one point. And joining us for the very first time, I'm very excited for this, we've got Dekzeh and his sexy accent joining us, who is a longtime Smogon veteran as well as a former SPL manager, among other things. So let's break the ice with just a very simple, generic part of this topic, and then we'll get into more specifics. Do all three of us agree, starting with Jabba, that in old gens there are some things that should be banned?
I would say yes. I would say, especially since the old gens, when we were coming up, I mean, believe it or not, because suspect testing and the whole tiering process has felt like it's been around forever, but it literally was not created until the middle of Gen 4. Me and Jumpman, I would say, were the pioneers of the suspect testing process in its infancy. And it was kind of based on we need to do something about tiering that isn't just 3 or 4 guys up at the top looking at something and going, yeah, let's just do that, whatever, and not properly dealing with the repercussions of that. It was especially terrible in, I would say, the lower tiers, such as UU, where it was usually just one guy going, yeah, that should probably be BL, I think. So I think we're looking at a situation where a lot of those gens, especially Advance, which has been touched a little bit and is starting to be touched on more, especially with the recent Baton Pass ban, I think they could use some late stage reworking a little bit to make them more competitive, especially since these past gens are seeing a lot of tournament play, but on the flip side haven't been properly tiered, so they're not as competitive as they can be.
Okay, and we'll throw it over to Dekzeh. Without getting into specifics, we'll do that in a moment. Do you agree, Dekzeh, that in old gens there are some things that should be banned?
Well, I can't speak much to tiers other than Advanced, which is pretty much all that I play. I mean, I have heard from others that there are issues in other tiers, but in Advanced, I like the position the tier is now, but I wish there were more action towards addressing threats and possible suspects, possible bans, and not. It's a good start what happened with the Baton Pass, but it's just a start, and I hope we won't go another 2 or 3 years without anything else happening.
So we can start with Advanced because that's a tier that all three of us are familiar with. I'll throw it right back to Dekzeh. We'll take one of the classic examples, something that's been banned for a very, very long time. Evasion moves. Cannot use double team or minimize. Dekzeh, do you agree with those moves where they are now, which is that they are banned, you cannot use them?
Oh, I not only agree, I think we should extend that ban to other things that alter evasion. I don't like evasion in a competitive environment at all. It promotes no skill, and it's just not the kind of thing you want to decide who's the winner, who's the better player, and so on.
Jabba, where do you stand on Gen 3 evasion moves?
I agree with him completely, and I think it's worth pointing out that in all my years in Smogon, there's always been this weird subset crowd. Well, maybe not weird. I don't want to call any of the potential viewers weird, but there's been this crowd that goes, well, we need We need a minimalist set of rules. And not that many people in a competitive environment use evasion moves, so it shouldn't be on the ban list. That to me doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Dex is right. The moves are completely uncompetitive, and there's absolutely no reason they should be allowed. So to argue that we should allow them because, well, no one's going to really use them anyway because they're not percentage efficient, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't like the minimalist rule set argument.
So a term / a devil's advocate argument that's going to come up a lot in this talk, so I'm just going to get it out of the way right now because it's going to come up, is basically a lot of people that are against bans cite the reason of cartridge purity, if you want to call it that. Basically, if it's allowed in the cartridge, if you could do it in the cartridge, it should therefore be allowed on the simulator because in their mind, the simulator, the competitive battles that we do, should be exactly like or as close to as possible the cartridge. So they are fundamentally against us going in and picking moves such as evasion moves and saying you can't use that because you can use it in the cartridge. That's an argument. That's a bigger picture argument. We'll get to that a little later in the show, but that's going to come up a lot. There's two different approaches to why you don't like bans. There are people who don't agree that a particular thing is overpowered, but then there's people who go, yeah, evasion moves are uncompetitive, but it's in the cartridge, therefore we should allow it anyway. So I'll go back to Jabba. Is there any validity to quote-quote cartridge purity, or people who want to keep the simulator as close to the cartridge games as possible? Do you see any merit to that?
No, and shout out to the CALLOUS Discord channel. We've been having a lot of variations on this discussion. I think it's a really interesting discussion to be had, considering the amount of RNG that Pokemon has. So as a baseline, I should get out of the way that as far as cartridge purity is concerned, I am potentially one of the, in Smogon's history, one of the biggest extremists against cartridge purity. I supported back in, I don't even know when it was, 2013 maybe. It was either DPP or early Black and White. I was one of probably 10 people total. This shows you how much of a minority I am on this. I supported a complete removal of critical hits from the game because I think they are to the extremist point that they affect the game in such a negative way, and the positives of critical hits have such little effect on the game compared to the extreme negative effects they have on the game that they should just be flat out removed. So when it comes to me, I obviously think that cartridge purity is nonsense because I'm willing to go that far to improve the game.
Dekzeh, your thoughts on the concept of cartridge purity?
Well, I'm a little more mixed on cartridge purity than Jabba. For example, I really wouldn't remove critical hits from the game. I'd love if they didn't exist, but I wouldn't remove them. Because that's the game we play. When I don't know about you guys, but when I first got into competitive Pokemon, I went to net battle at the time and I built my in-game team and I wanted to battle people. So I don't like to have a completely different game than what is in the cartridge. But at the same time, I'm not a complete purist. And just some examples that spring to mind. I absolutely hate the sleep talk mechanic change in Advance that happened because after years and years of us playing the same way, someone found that there was a glitch in the cartridge and then it was different. And same for the RBY, paralysis from normal types using Body Slam. All of that, I am really against keeping to cartridge. But I'm not one to say that we should change the way the games were made for balance. That's not our job, and I don't think it should be. I think that's something that's up to Nintendo, even if they suck at it.
I'm also somewhere in the middle. I don't know that I'm as extreme as Jabba. Jabba often on these shows has an extreme viewpoint, and that makes for great discussion. I don't know that I'm willing to go so far as to mess with mechanics that are core to the game, but I'm definitely open-minded about not allowing certain moves, not allowing certain Pokemon, things like that. What Dekzeh brought up is a really good point, and I mean, this discussion can go 10 different ways. There's going to be a lot to cover in this hour, but we can go the way that Dekzeh just took it. So, to give people a little background, this was not discovered. RBY, keep in mind, came out literally over 20 years ago and has been played competitively forever, before some of these guys that are listening to this were even born. And it just got discovered, what year was that, 2016 maybe? A couple of years ago, that when a normal type Pokemon uses Body Slam, which is a very, very important move in competitive RBY, against another normal type Pokemon, so like say a Snorlax on a Snorlax, they actually cannot paralyze each other. And that actually is part of the cartridge mechanic. It's been there the whole time, just nobody knew. Nobody figured it out until a million years later. So there are some people who argue, you know what, it's been unchanged for literally 15 plus years, even if it's technically wrong by the cartridge. It's been this way so fucking long, just leave it alone. How do you feel about that, Jabba, where people can openly admit, yes, this is wrong by the cartridge. We know for a fact the cartridge does in fact do this a different way, but it's been a certain way for so long, just leave it. Do you see any potential upside or validity to that argument?
I for one, as a baseline, I think going, well, we should leave it the way it's always been, slightly contradicts the position. Contradicts the position that I want to play Pokemon. I want to stick to the cartridges. Don't remove critical hits because they're part of the game. Well, Body Slam not paralyzing normal Pokemon is also part of the game. So it's difficult to really see where that line is supposed to come in play. Is it just, well, it's always been this way, even though it wasn't supposed to be? I personally think I'm ambivalent towards it. I think if you find out something's different, several years later, and it actually has an effect on the game, I think it should be implemented as long as it doesn't have a negative effect on the game. For something like the RBY Body Slam, I think that had a positive effect on RBY. It took a lot of luck out because now you can freely switch into Body Slams. You can have Body Slam switch targets. Like I know I can safely switch this in. What was the other one? The other one was Sleep Talk. Sleep Talk is a little different. So I don't know. It's all over the place. I don't know if you guys remember DPP when it was discovered that there was such a thing as toxic rain. Or was that? No, I think that was DPP. And we just all collectively decided, no, let's not do that. Quickly for the viewers, I forget, maybe Dekzeh remembers better than I do. It was some weird mechanic where if you had sand up,
it basically made Rain Dance kill stuff.
Yeah,
it was something weird like that.
Yeah, exactly. It would like double the sand damage or something. It was crazy. It was intense. And I remember we had this discussion about implementing a mechanic that's in the game that we knew was a bug. And I guess that's where, because, oh my God, this discussion came up all the time in the old days. It was authorial intent. What did the makers intend? So we would try to step into their mind and go, well, they clearly did not intend for this bug to be there. And I guess with the Sleep Talk thing, you could almost do the same thing. They probably did not intend for Sleep Talk to not properly burn turns. That's probably a bug, so we can keep it out of the game.
Yeah, I think trying to divine the intention of the developer is a very slippery slope, and
it is. But sometimes you have to do it. Like with Toxic Ring, you had to do it, but then you had to draw the line. Where do we go if something is questionably a bug? What do we do then? You know.
We're going to get into that part in a little bit in this talk as to what the criteria for a ban should be, what's important to us when discussing bans. But let me pull it back for a second. Go back to Dekzeh. Do you see any validity in the thought process that something has been the same way for literally a decade and therefore should be left alone? That, like, after a certain amount of time passes, it should just be let be, even if there's a discovery after the fact. Do you at all agree with that?
Well, I haven't really thought about it in that way, but I think I do agree with that. Especially if I believe the change is negative to the tier, like it was with Sleep Talk in Advance. And like with the whole dev's intentions and stuff, it's pretty obvious Sleep Talk wasn't supposed to reset the counter. And I think it's also pretty obvious that in RBY, Body Slam shouldn't be not paralyzing other normal types. So if you want to go that route, those were bugs that no one found or cared to. They weren't really relevant enough that people didn't find for 10, almost 20 years. So why should we change that now? Because we set our competitive metagame around that for so long.
Yeah, so this kind of brings us to the meat and potatoes of the argument, which is why do we ban or not ban something in the first place? And I think this should be kind of a straightforward, crystal clear thing, but it doesn't seem to be. Different people have different approaches. Some people believe we should be trying to just take as much RNG or variance out of the game as possible, but then some people say back, well, you're not playing Pokemon anymore. Other people think that, again, cartridge purists, no matter what it is, no matter how much variance, no matter how much RNG, if it's part of the game, it should be part of competitive. Other people think that bans should be on a case-by-case basis, and the community should be able to pick and choose what they do or do not want in the game. And it's kind of a slippery slope. So we'll start with like an egregious example that is basically universally agreed upon as something that should be banned. Basically something that breaks the game. So going back to RBY, the moves Fly and the move Dig are banned. And the reason for that is if a Pokemon using Fly or Dig while it's flying in the air or while it's digging underground, if it's fully paralyzed or if it attacks itself in its confusion, the Pokemon becomes literally invincible. It's basically an auto win. You actually cannot damage it or hurt it anymore for the rest of the game. And this is clearly a bug. This is not a mechanic. This was clearly unintended. So I think extreme examples like that of things that were crystal clear, not intended to be a feature, and things that actually break the game, that actually make it so a player cannot be beaten, I think we're in universal agreement that things like that should be banned. What's a little trickier is when we're trying to determine if something is competitive or not competitive, and people want to ban it not because it's a glitch, but because it is something that was clearly intended but is uncompetitive. So, a great example of this would be ADV Sandveil, or DPP Sandveil / Frostcloak. That gets a little bit trickier. Snowcloak, rather, sorry. So we're going back to evasion moves. Clearly these were intended. Sandveil making things miss is not a glitch. That's what it's designed to do. So when it is crystal clear that that's what it's supposed to be doing, give us the basis, Dekzeh, as to why, when that is clearly an intended feature, why should we be able to take that out of the game?
Well, simply because it's not too good. Maybe too good, but not just too good, but also too random, too out of the control. And there is a similar example to that happened in Gen 6, I think, which was the Swagger. I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry.
No, you got it right. Swagger, yeah.
Yeah, the Swagger ban that happened in Gen 6. And I think similar bans to that should happen retrospectively in pretty much every gen. There's stuff like, not exactly Swagger, but other stuff like evasion abilities and evasion items. There's no reason for them to be in a competitive environment. And I think it's pretty simple. I don't know why you won't extend to other tiers if you've done in some.
Now, is there any argument, Dekzeh, to someone who says, I would get it if Tyranitar or Donphan or something actually relevant had Sandvale, but all the Sandvale Pokemon suck, therefore it does not matter. Like, who cares about Cacturne or Gligar? Do you think that matters? Even if the ability is too good, if the Pokemon that have the ability suck, does that change anything for you?
Not really, especially because the question to me is not whether it is too good or too broken or too strong. It's because it's not competitive. So it doesn't matter if it's a Gligar or a Cacnea even. If it's dodging my move that would kill it for no reason other than sheer luck, why is it in the game?
So it's
a game that we try to compete. There's no reason for it, in my opinion, of course.
So it's strictly on principle for you, because you're not arguing that Cacnea is overpowered. We all agree on that. It's not that it's too strong, just on principle it shouldn't be there.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that it's not too good, because, 70% of the time it will just die or do nothing in the game. But then there's just one game where it wins you the game for no reason.
Jabba, taking that to you. First of all, should Sandvale be banned in ADV?
Without a doubt, yeah.
It should.
Should be banned in every gen that exists, yes.
Is that because it is too powerful, or is that on principle?
No, and this goes back to the exact same thing I essentially said for evasion moves. I mean, you can say, well, it's not good and people aren't going to use it, but at a baseline, it's uncompetitive. There's a difference between using, Fire Blast and Flamethrower. If I use Fire Blast, the expectation is that 15% of the time I'm going to miss. If I use Flamethrower, the expectation is I'm going to hit every single time. If there's something in the game that changes the ladder to a non-100%, then it should not be in the game.
So based on that, do you believe that Bright Powder should be banned?
Yes.
Do you, Dekzeh?
Absolutely.
What about similar items to Bright Powder? Do you think Quick Claw should be banned?
Yes.
Dekzeh?
Of course. Yep. Should be banned.
All of these. Scope Lens.
Which one's that? Is that the crit one?
It's the critical hit one.
No. If you want to increase your crit chance instead of your damage, go for it.
If you go by principle, I guess maybe, but not even. And also, Scope Lens has a pretty cool niche in newer gens with, like, what's the move that boosts critical? I don't know. There's some King Draw set that runs Scope Lens, and it always crits. It's kind of cool, actually.
Okay, but basically,
I'm obviously for removing crits from the game, but if you're not going to remove them, it'd be the same. Like, should Stone Edge be banned because that has an increased critical chance? No, because you're capping at what, like 12.5% with that anyway. No.
All right, so it's basically the reason I'm using these examples. All right, you guys don't like evasion moves. That's fine. So double team, minimize, Sandvale, Snowcloak, all that gone. That's fine. How do you explain, yes, we should get rid of Quick Claw, no, we should not get rid of Scope Lens? What is the differentiator there? Neither one of them has anything to do with evasion. Why is Quick Claw uncompetitive, whereas something like Scope Lens, which can randomly give you a crit, which Jabba just said is the worst and most game-impacting thing there is, why should Quick Claw be out but Scope Lens be in? I'm not saying I disagree with you, but I want you to defend your point to the viewers.
It's the effect that it has on an attack. So, Scope Lens essentially ups your expected damage by whatever the additional 6.5 or 6.25% crit chance would be. You're increasing expected damage. Now, in a world where you're going to allow critical hits because you think removing them from the game is too much, increasing the expected value of critical hits over the course of a game should not be banned, in my opinion, if you're going to allow those as a base. Obviously, I would prefer that they're just removed completely. But if you're going to allow them, an item that modifies them somewhat, I mean, because we allow all that other stuff. We allow moves that increase critical hit. So to draw the line at items that increase critical hit would just not make any sense considering what else is allowed that affects critical hits.
So why,
on the other hand, Quick Claw
why Quick Claw
does essentially the same thing as, say, Bright Powder or that's all I can think of right now. But it essentially does the same thing as that. You're looking at a situation where this should happen, but every once in a while it doesn't. I should attack first and kill you and win the game, but every once in a while I'm not going to because of this item. It's essentially, it plays out the same almost as evasion does. Because it's no different than missing an attack. It's just the other person goes first.
Is that your thought process, Dekzeh? You also said no Quick Claw. Why is that? Why should Quick Claw not be in the game?
Well, I think it's about the impact of the odds. I mean, Quick Claw has the chance of you just moving first, ignoring stats. And Scope Lens increases your critical hit chance. I think every item in the game has to have some risk-reward ratio. And Pokemon is a game of odds. There are moves that flinch, there are moves that have a critical hit a bit higher, and other stuff, chances of burning, freezes, paralyzes, and so on. So if you want to use your item slot to get a small advantage, I think you should be allowed to. That's okay with Scope Lens for me. It's balanced, I guess. And I think other items like Quick Claw or Bright Power are not properly balanced because the upside is too high.
What would you say to someone who argues back that the drawback of Quick Claw is every single time it doesn't activate, that's a turn you're not getting lefties. If you just had leftovers on it, you'd be gaining all this HP, and you can miss 7 Quick Claw turns in a row and be missing out on all that lefties HP, and that balances it out. Do you not agree with that?
Well, the thing you have to note in the example is that you wouldn't use Quick Claw in a mon that is expected to live for 7 turns. So that risk-reward ratio is different. Quick Claw is an item that's really good on more suicidal approaches that can give you a really, really high upside.
So you guys are obviously cool with approaching bans as a case-by-case basis as opposed to just a blanket, it's always this or it's always that, which I think is the right way to handle it. I think that with the differences between gens, the differences between mechanics, I think it's impossible to just blanket ban something for every single gen or for every single tier. I think that's really, really hard to do. So that prompts the question of, is there any instance, I already know Jabba's answer because he wants to get rid of crits, but is there any instance where you'd be willing to mess with mechanics? For example, what if someone proposed taking freezes out of Gen 1? Because in Gen 1, you cannot thaw. Freeze is permanent, freeze is game-breaking.
I literally also said that other thing the other day.
I was just going to ask you, what would your position be on removing freeze from Gen 1 and why?
I 100% support it. It's game-breaking, in my opinion. It's way too good. It essentially turns every single freeze move into a 10% one-hit KO move, which are banned because they're busted. But to go further, I think leaving the moves in is too important for the game. Like, obviously, ice moves themselves you can't remove for the game; they do too much. So, in my opinion, in situations like this, you just have to go, you know what? This clearly was not built with competitiveness in mind. It's a mess. All right, so here we are, 20 whatever years later. We want to keep the core the same. We want it to play out the same because we like that. But how about we take the most broken things that exist in this, which currently in the game would be freeze, and remove it so that it can slot in easily, to our SPLs, to our whatever other tournaments we're having, and not have matches come down to absolute bullshit.
Dekzeh, what would you say to someone proposing banning freezing from RBY?
Well, I think I don't play RBY enough to know it, but from what I see, it's pretty impactful. It's basically, like Jabba said, a one-hit KO move. and those are banned. So, in my opinion, we have things like freeze clause, sleep clause. We could have a more strict freeze clause applied to RBY only that prevents all stances of freezes and not only the second one. I don't have an issue with that if the player base agrees that those are broken. That's how the banning process should go.
So we'll use this particular example. We'll use freeze and RBY just for argument's sake. Regardless of our personal feelings on the matter, this is a good example. Let's just say, for argument's sake, hypothetically, that the overwhelming majority of the competitive RBY community agrees, yes, we don't want freezes in RBY, they're too impactful, just for argument's sake. The question now becomes, how do you handle that situation? There are multiple solutions. For example, do you just remove freeze, period? Like you keep Ice Beam and Blizzard, but they just don't freeze anymore. If you do that, do they now do something else? Do they maybe paralyze? Do they flinch? Do they do something else? Another solution, well, maybe you just ban Ice Beam. Maybe you just ban Blizzard. You just get rid of the moves. Another solution, maybe you make it so in RBY, after 2 turns, a Pokemon thaws, which was not in the game, but we could do it that way. So this is kind of where the whole slippery slope comes in. What is the solution out of, those different options? Which one do you go with, and who gets to decide? Who gets to say, you know what, keeping Ice Beam in but not letting it freeze is better than having it where it can freeze, but you thaw 2 turns later? Is this to be put to a vote among the top players? Is this something that a council should decide? Is this something that none of us have the right to decide? What path do we take as far as addressing something, if it's agreed upon that it even needs to be addressed? Again, this is the hypothetical scenario where the community agrees, freezes are too good, let's do something about it. What's the path? What is the right way to address that situation, Dekzeh?
Well, I think it should start with the council, but obviously taking input from everyone that plays the tier in question. And there are multiple options, and in this case, I think cartridge purity plays a role, but not that we should stay by it, but we should change the minimum possible. And we already have a freeze clause that when there's when there's a second freeze in a game.
Yeah, we're
you get the message
blocking the second freeze, but not the first freeze. So why not just take it a step further?
We're changing the mechanic for the second freeze. Why not just change it for the first one instead? I mean, I don't know if this came to a serious topic between the council and stuff, what would they decide? But this is my opinion. It's the most logical course for me.
Now, Jabba, do you agree with that? And if you do, can you tell us why, if I'm on the other side of that argument, if I say, no, I think we should just make it so you can be frozen, but you thaw 2 turns later. Wait a minute, why is your idea better than mine? Tell me, Jabba, why that specific course of action, a freeze clause on the first freeze instead of the second, tell me why that idea is better than my idea of you can freeze, but you thaw 2 turns later.
I mean, maybe it isn't. And I think... And it's kind of the way we did things back in Gen 4. There was always... And I've seen a lot of it today. I mean, you look at the advance vote, the baton pass. They presented several options. The community got to discuss what those options were, and then they got to vote on them. And that is my preferred method. It's you get the known, the best players essentially in a room, the policy review subforum, and you have them hash it out. Everyone discusses, this is what I think the solution is, this is what I think the solution is, and then it's not the council's job to decide which one they prefer. They just essentially decide the initial issue. They go, well, I think freeze in RBY is a little janked up. I think it's too good, the result of it. Now tell me what you guys think. And they can throw their own opinions in too, but then after that, their job is to just set the parameters for the voting requirements and then host the vote. I don't like decisions. I mean, if you've seen any of my discussions from back in probably like 2011 was when the tiering discussions went on. I don't like decisions that are made by a small group of people, because no matter what happens, you're going to end up with a small group of people that's mostly filled with morons. And I think they're going to always end up being bigger morons than the site populace at large. So I always support a system where you essentially take what ends up probably being the top 5-ish% of players, and they get to discuss and vote on this issue.
So let's talk for a moment about not bans, but unbans. For example, recently, Latias was unbanned from DPP.
What fucking moron did that?
I mean, why don't you tell us? I mean, like...
Is that really a thing? I've heard. I've seen that, and I've never bothered asking, because that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
No, I thought you were joking at first. Yeah, no, it really is unbanned. Keeping in mind that Salamence and Garchomp, for example, currently remain banned. But yeah, Latias has recently been unbanned, so...
Who voted on that?
Well, I'm going to throw it back over to Dekzeh. I mean, why do you think that happened? And then, what should the approach be for an unban? Because it's really easy to see why you ban something. It's been too dominant in tournaments lately. This is clearly, the percentages. We have data on this. It's showing us it's too good. But we don't have data on, Latios and ADV, Mew and ADV. I mean, these things are rightfully banned. But for argument's sake, if you wanted to unban something, how do you approach that?
Oh, it's obvious, a lot more tricky. And just, you say they are rightfully banned, but there are people who believe things like Latias should be unbanned in advance. I mean, I don't know if you know, but Undisputed is in favor of unbanning Latias for a long time, and Nastamatitos too. And I don't know what they have in mind with that. I'm completely against it, but...
That thing would dominate Advance.
Yeah, exactly.
You think CM Jirachi is bad? Wait till you see something that has 350 speed.
Yeah, all three of us agree. Latios should be gone. But for argument's sake, if you really truly want to investigate that, you want to unban it, how do you go about that? How do you go about testing, unbanning it, and then what would need to happen for that to really, truly be a thing?
It's a lot more complicated, because in newer gens, in a situation like this, you can set up a suspect ladder with Saidman unbanned and test it. But in our older gens, there's no active player base for it. So it all comes from a lot of talking and a lot of ideas, and not so much in practice. So I think it's really, really hard to find a way to unban something. And honestly, I think we're in a spot where there are more issues that need to be addressed instead of potentially adding more issues. I don't think there's anything really that needs to be unbanned in older gens. But it's a trend, because we got the Excadrill unbanned in Black and White, and Latias now in DPP. And the process was similar. I think there was a ladder that was set up with those mons, and the player base decided. I think the way it was done was ideal, but the results, I don't know if they're correct or not.
Yeah,
I think we should be more worried about the process than the results. And I think the process were fair.
So Jabba, tell us what you think, exactly what Dekzeh just said, about the process, not necessarily the results. So what they did when they wanted to unban Latias is they had, whatever it was, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it was, of suspect testing it on the ladder. They made it very clear that everybody's doing this. They had a bunch of guys test it out, and then they had people based on that, so they could actually get a feel of what it would look like if Latias were allowed. They had people vote on it, and obviously the result was they voted that it should be allowed. But regardless of the result, what do you think of that process? Is that the best way to do it if you want to unban something?
I think the process is tied into the result. And I'm going to start off by saying that everyone that was involved with that process of unbanning Latias is a short-sighted moron. And here's why. And it ties into the process of that. It's because you're going back on a generation that had seen main play. We're talking main being the main tier for several years, okay? And now you're going back, and it's at this point in time, it's seeing fringe play. It's seeing tournament play. It's not seeing the level of play it was seeing before. And now you're going back and you're adding a suspect test to a tier that's not seeing a lot of play. And then you're holding a vote. And what happens is you're having such a small sample size. And I think the result of the Latias vote shows why this is an issue, because Latias, in its existence in DPP, took a very long time to ban. And it was because as time went on, it became more and more obvious that Latias was a huge problem. You got to a point where if you weren't running Scizor or you weren't running Tyranitar, then you were just going to get gamed by Latias. And that was a slow progression. It wasn't overnight. People weren't even running offensive Latias for the longest time, because Latias is a great defensive Pokemon. Most people were running, a Recover Scent, Reflect, stuff like that. Maybe like a bulky CMer. Those weren't issues, but it slowly got to the point where offensive Latias took over the metagame. But people have such short memories, they don't remember that. So now here we are several years later, and people are going, you know what, Latias doesn't look that bad. And then they slap together a few week test, and then at the end of it, they go, that wasn't that bad. But you're overturning a decision that took years to get to. And by the end of those years, everyone was in unanimous agreement that this Pokemon was too strong for the metagame. So you're overturning years of bulk player experience in 2 or 3 weeks of a much smaller player base experience. And it's just a terrible idea. And I think it's very short-sighted, and I think everyone that engaged in it is a little dumb.
Well, can I just ask you something then? Do you believe that unbans shouldn't happen in older gens, or do you think there is a better process?
I don't think there's a way you can cleanly do an unban. It's unfortunate because you do look at some situations where maybe there should be an unban. Especially in the older tiers where something just flat wasn't tested. And now with our new goggles on, that we can see that some things aren't broken all the time. Maybe Mew isn't broken all the time, but we never tested it, so we'll never know. But the issue is that we're so late in the game that there's not an efficient way to test that isn't just going to get people. Essentially, people want something new. People get bored very quickly. So what's going to happen is they're always going to vote for something that shakes it up, even if it has long-term negative impacts on the tier. So even if in advance, the option came up, do you want to unban Mew? And we had a 2-week test, I guarantee people would vote to unban it because they just want a shake-up. But at the end of the day, it's not healthy for the tier.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the whole thing you said about just wanting to shake up the metagame or change something. And in the Latias case, it was pretty obvious because before the voting happened, you could see for months that people were extremely biased into unbanning it. Like the process wasn't even necessary there because it would happen. Everyone knew. And that came with a lot of top players actually vouching for it and making campaigns for it for a long time. I know BKC, for example, vouched for Latias unban for a long time. And I think it comes down to just wanting a change in the metagame. You're bored of playing the same thing for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It gets boring. It's repetitive.
See, a lot of what Jabba said goes back to the argument that I was trying to make significantly earlier in the video, where I said, something has been untouched for a decade. What do you do at that point? And it's like using Jabba's example of Mew in ADV. If we decided, hey, we want to seriously look at unbanning this, the timing really does matter, because just like Gen 4 or any other gen, there was a time where Gen 3 was the gen. If you were playing, that's what you were playing. That was the competitive thing. But that has long since come and gone, and it will never come back again. That's just the way it is. So just like, yeah, it sucks that we kind of missed out on that prime window, that, optimal tons and tons of players window to really truly test it out and find out. But we did. That's the reality of it. We missed the window. So, I mean, if we don't think a small group is good enough to make these decisions, then I think the only other logical conclusion is that things just cannot be unbanned. And I don't know that I am satisfied with that solution, but if we're saying it's not okay that a small sample size or a small group or a couple of weeks, if that is not adequate to unban something, then I don't know what is, because I don't think old gens in particular are ever going to be more than that. I don't think old gens are ever going to be more than a small group or people playing it for the weekend because there's a test going on. There's never going to be a time where people suddenly go, wow, 15,000 of us want to focus on Gen 3. Screw the new gens. We're going back to ADV. That's just never going to be a thing. So I don't know where that leaves us as far as unbans, and I'd be very open to solutions.
Maybe there is an option if you want to tie it into SPL and kind of use the 10 weeks of SPL. So do that 2 week to a month suspect test, and then vote for a probationary unban through, and time it so that you run it through SPL. Because while maybe the Pokemon might end up being too strong for SPL, I think the players would appreciate a shakeup in the metagame. And then at the end of that term, which ends up being about 3 months, we have a permanent vote. And then we get extremely high-level tournament testing results to back up the test.
Right, but the counter-argument to that is you get 2-3 weeks into SPL, and it is crystal clear already that this thing is way too fucking good, and it should...
I don't know, then just have an emergency vote, man. I don't know.
Can I have another counter-argument? I think it's really bad that you take the most prestigious tournament that's supposed to be the most competitive to show who's the best player or whatever people care about these days. And you take that metagame and you make it completely unstable by adding some potentially broken mon.
Yep.
Sure, it's fun, but it's not ideal competitively.
Well, it's being added anyway, so the way it is. So I'm essentially trying to form a middle ground between the current way and a version in which we don't even look at these Pokemon. And that is to use SPL as the high-level testing ground. And I mean, at the end, I don't think adding something like that would that insanely impact the tournament itself, but I think it would give everyone a very good basis for it. And because Latias is going to be added to Gen 4 SPL anyway. So if we come back on that a little bit and add that middle ground where after SPL let's have a second vote, because now on top of having this ladder experience, now we have a high-level tournament experience between 10 of the best TPP players in the game. Now we can really form a vote. It's not really using SPL as a testing ground, just more, look, this is what happened in SPL. Are we still good with that decision?
I think that's okay, especially in the Latias case. It was unbanned 2 months ago. And there will be an SPL, and there was a World Cup already, or was it after World Cup? I don't know, I wasn't around. But anyway, there will. I would really like if it was revoted after some time, because I agree with you that the testing in some small sample size with some random players that won't be playing at the highest level is not the same.
So even though it was just unbanned such a short time ago, just 2 months ago, you would be in favor of, after SPL, of re-voting on it, and if the top guys, if 8 or 9 out of the SPL guys go, this was clearly too good, it was a problem every week, we should re-ban this, you would be open to that, Dekzeh?
Yeah, I think that should be the process from the start. It was a ban 2 months ago, and it should already be clear, okay, we're doing this now, but we'll have another vote in 7 months after SPL or whatever. I think that would be a more fair process.
That's fair. So one thing I haven't even gotten to touch on yet, we're actually later in the video that I thought we only have maybe 10 minutes and change left. It's been such a good discussion. I meant to bring this up earlier. But another angle on this topic is air quotes, I hate this term, by the way, complex bans. And that term annoys the crap out of me because they're really not all that complex. People just use...
Blame, what's the name? Shit, who came? Alderaan. Blame Alderaan.
It's such a stupid term. People use it because it's like choosing your wording specifically in order to deter you from going with the ban. It's supposed to make it seem complicated or daunting or whatever. And
you're completely right. It definitely is word manipulation because people don't like things that are complex. You could call it a combination ban and it would say the same exact thing.
Oh, there's a million.
But when it add a negative, connotation to it.
That's exactly what it is. It gives it a negative connotation, and it makes people view it or register it as a bad thing. So complex bans, to make sure everyone listening knows what that means. Basically, there are people out there who are against banning part of something, but not all of something. So an example would be if you wanted to ban, say, Sandvale in ADV, the argument is, well, do you have to ban Dugtrio now? You can't just ban part of it, right? You can't just ban Sandvale. Maybe that's a bad example. A better example would be Shadow Tag, for example, with Chandelure.
No. Here, you're stumbling. No, Sandvale's a good example. What the quote unquote complex ban would be is that you can't run both Sandstorm and Sandvale on the same team. Well, that would be the complex ban.
Well, there's another way too. Like I said, Shadow Tag with Chandelure. A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, you don't need to ban the whole Pokemon. Why don't you just make it so it can't have Shadow Tag? It has to use its
That's not a complex ban.
Well, but people have a problem with that aspect of it. With you can't use X with Y. You can use either one individually, but you cannot use them together. There were weather bans in newer gens as well. But basically, yes, we'll use what you just said. So
Alderaan's proposal, quote unquote, was probably the biggest complex ban, or maybe the first. Maybe some have happened since then, but this is the most famous one from when I was around. It was that you could not run Rain Dance and Swift Swimmers on the same team.
I remember that. Okay, so forgetting, that's a good example, but forgetting the specifics of it, whether or not you think Rain Dance plus Swift Swim is too good, Dekzeh, on principle, what are your thoughts on complex bans?
I'm completely in favor. I would do like a dozen complex bans just out of my mind right now. There's no reason to have a lot of things that we do.
All right, give us 2 examples that we haven't already brought up.
For example, in DPP and above, Iron Head on Jirachi. Iron Head is the perfectly balanced move. Jirachi is arguably balanced. When you put the two together, it's ridiculous. A 60% flinch rate on, say, a Scarf Jirachi is ridiculous.
All right, so hold on, back that up. Your problem isn't actually specifically Jirachi. Your problem is Iron Head and Serene Grace.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Those shouldn't be allowed together, for example.
Give us one more example.
Well, Sandvale was already brought up, and there's like what was just banned right now, which was Bellydrum plus Baton Pass on Smeargle.
And you do or do not agree with that?
That one I do not. Just an example. But like a lot of Baton Pass could be handled better with complex bans.
All right, so I'll have Jabba feed off of Dekzeh's example. Something like Iron Head on a Serene Grace user. So if someone proposed you cannot have Iron Head on a Pokemon with the ability Serene Grace, but otherwise you can use Pokemon with Serene Grace and you can use Pokemon with Iron Head, but not together. What do you think about that, Jabba?
Oh, sorry.
You missed that?
No, I need to take a sip of water.
Gotcha.
I completely agree with that. I think complex ban, quote unquote, complex bans are a more nuanced way of banning things in a way that results in more potential diversity. Because one of the great things about Pokemon, of course, is all the Pokemon and all the different move sets on those specific Pokemon you can run. Instead of, say Jirachi is broken literally only because it can flinch something down from 50% that it's doing, 8% to. Scarfrachi, I've lost my Magnezone way too many times to Scarfrachi. This is absolutely nonsense. If that's too much, it's far better to take out a small issue than it is to just completely ban a Pokemon. Because then we, are left with a situation where we still have Jirachi in the metagame, and that adds diversity to the metagame. It adds, a check to something. It adds an interesting Pokemon you can use. And I think if we could use that in a lot of ways to issue more targeted bans so that we just have more options at the end of the day. But I think at the core of the Smogon banning philosophy has been we want to avoid that. But I don't think that has been healthy for the game. I think from a early time, the perspective should have been we should be trying to ban the least Pokemon, and if more moves or more abilities get hit in that's fine because we still have more Pokemon we can all use.
So let's go back to the process, because everybody has ideas about bans, not bans, and what it should or shouldn't be. That's great. Let's talk about the process. That's the part everybody disagrees with. So how would someone get to define and identify what is or is not too good, such as, because there would obviously be an argument if someone said, all right, Iron Head on Jirachi is too good. Some people would argue it is, some people would argue it isn't. So where do you even start on identifying what ideas are valid and what ones aren't? And then how would you go about actually testing that or voting on that or what have you? If you were to actually try to ban it, what would the process be?
Well, you can go first. Go ahead.
Yeah, it should be just like other processes are. Like, let's take the Baton Pass that happened right now. It starts with discussions between players on Discord or whatever, and then it becomes official when there's a testing and people vote. It should be the exact same for those complex bans. There's no reason they shouldn't be treated the same.
So it should be put to a vote.
Well, yeah, I think it should be the exact same process we use for other changes in the tier.
Okay, which for those who don't know, that specifically means that only people who qualify either through SPL or an extremely high ladder performance, only very specific people can actually vote. This is not open to the public. That's the way that you think it should be.
Yeah, I actually think the process we have is pretty good. Like we said before, it's kind of more difficult to deal with unbannings with this process, but for banning stuff, I think it's a good process.
Jabba, your thoughts on voting for case-by-case basis complex bans?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think you almost have to accept the fact that you're going to get it wrong a lot and that it may be a piecemeal process. And I think you have to be willing to take a shot on the complex bans. So, you look at a situation like Jirachi. Let's just keep using this example. Jirachi, Serene Grace, Iron Head. So you have that discussion and you go, well, I think this specific move breaks Jirachi. If not for Iron Head, Jirachi would be completely fine, if not a positive impact on our metagame. And then you're going to have that discussion with the top level players, and then you're going to have that vote. You're going to give them the option. This is what the community discussed. It's either Jirachi itself or it's Iron Head on Jirachi. So then you're going to have that vote, and then if it comes down with only Iron Head gets banned, you're going to have to go, well, okay, so this is banned now. We're going to have to see how this plays out. Maybe we find out Jirachi is still busted. Something else also breaks it, just a broken thing. And then that also comes to the question of where's the line? How how many complex bans are you willing to enact for a single Pokemon? What if Jirachi is broken with Ice Punch too? Just shit like that. Or Body Slam. That's a better example because that gets busted too with the 60% para. And now you're looking at a situation where it's like, how much of this Pokemon's moveset are we willing to ban just to keep it around? And it gets difficult, but I think in the long run, it still ends up being a net positive, though it will be a longer process. So I guess it also depends on your time frame. So there's a lot that goes into it, and I think there's a lot of discussion to be had, a lot more than how much time we have left for what the proper way is to approach a situation. But I do think it's a net positive at the end of the day.
What's your counter argument to the hypothetical where, okay, you ban Ironhead on Jirachi and DPP, and that vote gets passed? Couldn't that have unforeseen and unintended effects on the metagame as a whole? Couldn't that, in turn, make things that were perfectly fine before, couldn't it make them broken now? Like, couldn't it basically, something that Jirachi kept in check by Jirachi is no longer kept in check, and now you have a different problem that you didn't have before?
That's hilarious because a lot of people listening to this right now probably were not around for the creation of the suspect testing process. But when me and Jumpman conceived the suspect testing process, this exact issue came up. So essentially we had stage 1, stage 2. It was a mess. We didn't know what we were doing. It was completely new. Cut us some slack. So we started off where we tested, I think, everything together and then everything one at a time, or maybe the reverse. But then that exact question came up. What if Latias is fine, but, Latias plus Manaphy are too much for the metagame to handle. They just make an unstoppable combination. Or like you said, if you ban this one thing, now this other thing gets out of control. So, at that time, we decided that, what we need to do is we need to add – actually, you know what? That's what it might have been. It might have been that the individual testing was – I can't remember. I'm getting old. It was essentially we had to test to check for that exact issue, but it turned out the testing for that exact issue took way too long because you were essentially testing combinations. I think is what we ended up on. You test the combinations to see what the broken combinations are, and to test those out of the metagame just took way too long. So we just completely scrapped that and went, whatever happens, happens. And then if something else comes up broken, you know what? We'll just vote on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I can even like simplify it. I mean, Jabba, is Raikou broken in ADV?
No.
Is Kun broken in ADV?
You might be asking the wrong person on that. Yes.
Answer's no. Okay. So
it is very yes.
So the next question: if you were to ban Blissey from ADV, do those Pokemon all of a sudden have potential to be broken?
Yes, exactly. That is a huge issue. Yes, a lot becomes broken if you ban Blissey.
Now, granted, maybe not Raikou because you can kill it with.
Well, Blissey's broken at its core, which is it's a mess.
Well, that's kind
of a mess. That's why I don't like it.
I think a better example on that is imagine banning Dugtrio from Advance.
Sure.
Suddenly you have like 5 or 6 completely broken mons, like Heracross, Tyranitar.
Oh yeah, you would just run those full squad. Right now, Dugtrio is a huge check because you have to kind of look at your team and go, "Ah, shit, 4 of these died to Dugtrio. I probably shouldn't do this." But at their core, those are insanely good teams, like the Metagross, Heracross, T-Tar, squads where Jirachi.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't use Dugtrio as an example because Dugtrio is very important, but I don't think that Dugtrio is quote broken. Someone could.
Oh, it absolutely is broken.
Well,
Dugtrio is very broken.
Well, someone could make the argument that
absurdly broken.
Someone could make the issue that Blissey is broken or that it is overpowered, but the problem is
it is.
Sure, but there you go. Jabba thinks it is. But the problem is, the second you ban Blissey, and it's quote
Yeah,
quote
you open up a whole can of worms.
that's kind of the problem with complex bans. Like if you ban something with the best intentions in the world and you make that Pokemon quote quote fair, you may have accidentally just made something else.
Well, that
broken.
works for literally every ban you can enact. You might result in something else being broken, but then you just turn around and you ban that thing.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
just
Like,
you go,
for example,
it's turtles all the way down.
the issue is Gen 3 was the last gen before the changes to the suspect process and everything else. Because in Gen 3, it was literally just a few people sitting together talking and deciding everything. And like, if Gen 3 was a more recent gen using the current process, like 10, a dozen, 15 months would have been eventually banned. Because you start with the Trio, then you move to Tyranitar, then you move to, I don't know, Skarmory. And it just goes on. It would be a completely different tier. But I also think it would probably be more balanced.
Probably, yeah.
So real quick before we run out of time, are there scenarios where, again, like going back to like the Shadow Tag example, Wobbuffet's a terrible example because it basically doesn't function unless it traps you. But like Chandelure, for example, Chandelure rather, whatever. Do you have to ban the whole Pokemon because of Shadow Tag? Like, can you just say the Pokemon itself is allowed, it just cannot have Shadow Tag? Because some people are fundamentally against that. They believe, again, this is the whole cartridge purist crap, they believe that the ability Shadow Tag is inherently part of the Pokemon. You can't ban part of the Pokemon. You either ban the whole Pokemon or you don't. Agree or disagree?
You just complex ban Chandelure plus Shadow Tag. I don't see the issue with that.
So you think Chandelure itself should be allowed, just not with Shadow Tag?
Yeah, I think this issue came because... no, I'm wrong. Never mind what I was going to say. Just go on, Jabba.
I think the issue with Chandelure and why it was only a complex ban was because if you were going to ban Shadow Tag, you also were going to catch up Why Not? And so people were like, well, Why Not isn't even close to broken, so we have to make this a complex ban, or else it makes no sense. So I think that's the only reason that issue originally had come up in the first place, is because the only other Pokemon in the tier that had Shadow Tag was absolute garbage. I think it probably would have just made more sense to ban Shadow Tag, but...
Yeah, it's similar to the Sandveil on Cacnea.
Yeah, it's exactly spot on with that, yeah.
Alrighty, so since we are pretty much at the end of the video, I'm going to give you guys both a final opportunity to say your piece. The final question here is going to be what I would like to see going forward regarding banning philosophy is blank. Who wants to go first?
I need a second to think about it.
Jabba does. What I would like to see going forward regarding banning philosophy is...
way more bans.
Is way more bans.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think not only more bans, but at least more activity, less fear. Because a lot of people are really afraid of banning stuff. And I think we should be way more proactive on it.
Yeah, it's been a weird part of Smogon history where they're really hesitant to ban things. But a constant, or, like you said, more activity, it keeps things fresh. Let's constantly be looking at things and realizing that the tiers aren't balanced, and it's going to be hard to ever get them balanced. But let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do to work towards this. And I think it results in a lot of almost fun for the people who play the older gens. And, if you're going to throw in an unbanning process too, and you have one that actually works, as we discussed earlier, it may not be the easiest thing in the world, but if you combine that, you're looking at a situation where you can keep up interest in these old tiers that aren't seeing much play, and you can have people that are locked in on trying to help improve these tiers through both bans and unbans. And I think it creates more fun and I think you're working towards a more balanced tier.
Anything?
Yeah, the first step has to be to like admit the tiers we play are completely unbalanced, especially the older ones. Like we have to first admit that and then go from there, because there are a lot of things that wouldn't happen the way they did if the process was the one we use right now. So why not do that retroactively? Like for example, why is Snorlax allowed in GSC? And I mean, it checks the whole tire. So if you ban Snorlax, you have to change the whole thing because everything else is broken. But that is what we would do if GSU was the current generation. So why don't we go back and do that too?
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end it on. I think that should give the viewers something to think about. Honestly, I mean, I'm not going to keep these guys here all night, but we could go another hour on this topic. Banning and unbanning is a complex topic that nobody's ever going to agree on, but I think the takeaway for all three of us is that we would like to see more of an open mind and a different mindset towards bans. Don't be afraid of it. Maybe we can make the tiers actually better. But let us know what you think in the comments. Jabba, Dekzeh, thank you for joining, and if you guys like this video, leave me a thumbs up. I will catch you guys next time.